Hi, everybody. Today's topic is going to be getting multi-touch attribution right, lessons from a practitioner. And very lucky today to have my friend and a Bain advisor, the former chief scientist at Visual IQ, the multi-touch attribution originator that was eventually acquired by Nielsen a couple of years ago, Payman Sadek. Thank you very much for joining us, Payman. It's a great honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Caesar. Thank you. This is really such a pleasure to be speaking with you always, but specifically for this very interesting and important topic. Very nice to be here and talking to you.
Thanks for that. Very kind. So usually when we start these conversations, I want to start by just asking really about your background, your original training, kind of how you got started, how you got to the job, and a little bit about what you're up to now, which we'll come back to later.
Okay, sure. My background, my training is in mathematical statistics. I have my PhD in that field. And how I got there was from an engineering background. So it's very much like a winding path. That's how I got into statistics, mathematical statistics, and I got interested in that field. In the last 20 years, I've been in different roles in various industries, but the common denominator of all of them has been on data science, advanced analytics, but the industries were different. I worked in the aerospace industry for 5 or 6 years. And at some point, I was working on, analyzing onboard data, the aircraft onboard data to understand how faults occur and how you can optimally maintain fleets of aircraft. So it was very interesting, heavy, data science work. I also worked as the head of the data science in education assessment industry, and also in the last 10 years has been mostly focused on marketing and advertising, and that's where I joined the Visual IQ in 2010, and I was with the company until 2019. So about 8.5, 9 years I was with the company. Very exciting. And one of the things that both from my background perspective and also the work I did at Visual IQ is that working on different problems really exciting to me, and having that opportunity in Visual IQ was, and it allowed me to be working with various industries, from banking and financial services to retail to automotive, telecom, and applying all these learnings that we have and all the tools and approaches that we were building, the platforms that we were building across multiple industries was really exciting.
Very, very cool. Of course, there's an arc there. You're not the only person I've spoken with who has started with engineering roles and sort of physical science kind of applications, or
Yeah.
whether it's weather or aerospace engineering, and somehow gravitated to the world to the black hole of marketing and advertising. But anyway, I guess we all follow the data to a certain extent. So, want to pivot to the topic here. The central question, I think, that we're going to consider, and that I think is central for a lot of CMOs and their teams today, is really this question about how far to push multi-touch attribution. Like, how real is it? It's a holy grail, obviously, to be able to know exactly what everything contributes to a sale and to a returning customer and so forth. But I think it's important to try to understand what the practical limits of that would be. And so I think that's a really interesting area for us to explore, given how there's definitely a move now, an accelerating move to digital channels, both for brand purposes as well as for actual conversion. But maybe before we get into all that, maybe you could define the term a little bit further for us. So how would you define what MTA is? How is it different from traditional media mix modeling and testing approaches? Just say a little bit about that to ground things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good question. How do you even define this? So I start with how we defined it when I joined Visual IQ, how we defined this term, multi-touch attribution, where it came from. From a historical point of view, at the time, a lot of advertisers were focused on last touch attribution, right? It's an easy way, everyone understands it, but obviously that's also very wrong. I mean, you cannot, attribute the entire conversion to only the last touch. And one of the examples that, and I was thinking about this at some point, I came across, and now we're in the election season, and we have election in 18 days. So imagine that there is a state that you have one one candidate wins by a single vote. That could happen. That's very unlikely, but that can happen. I mean, actually in Florida in 2000, we were not that
Yes,
far off from
500
that
votes.
scenario.
Yeah.
Now, if you're just thinking of that, and there are, let's say 5 million have voted in that state for that, let's say the winning party. Now, whose one vote actually contributed to the win? Can you say the last person who voted? Well, maybe that's kind of logical, but if the first person didn't vote, you would also have flipped the election. Now, so that's kind of the idea of last click was easiest because you can always track, well, okay, the last guy who voted is the winner, and all the credit goes to that last person. And then when people start thinking about, well, no, maybe there are other ways of doing this, you can think of all those 5 million votes in that state to be equally consequential, right? That, as a matter of fact, at the time, this was one of the approaches to attribution. So, well, okay, we cannot attribute everything to the last touch, so let's do it equally across. And then some other, philosophies came about that, well, maybe some channels, they're openers, some are more solidifiers, some are closers. But again, there's a lot of, debate into what channel is closer, what is opener. Like search usually is thought of as a closer, but is it really? I mean, if you're thinking of buying a car, it's not that you see a display ad with a car, so, okay, I want to buy a car. It doesn't usually happen that way. You're thinking about this purchase and you go online, do some search, and that's, you may see an ad that takes you to a website that ultimately you stick with and, make your purchase. So as a matter of fact, in this case, search is an opener, not the closer. So then the thought became, okay, how can we, now that we have data science, and at that point, data science was becoming a thriving field, and people were thinking about, tying all, kinds of data, points together. That's where we started thinking about algorithmic attribution. And at the time, we called it a fractional attribution. So at the very high level, it was about, now that we live in a world that we can track every action of a consumer, especially on the digital side, how about just figuring out what differentiates the converter set from the non-converter set? So if you're seeing certain touch points more often among the converters, probably they're more consequential than the ones that you see more among non-converters. And that's how this algorithmic things came about. Now you can have multiple approaches, every vendor thinks of their solution as probably the best one and so forth. But at the bottom line of this is understanding how the converters and non-converters differentiate. Now, I want to tell you also another story about the definition of the term MTA. We were at the client meeting at some point, and so the client started talking about giving us every single characteristics of an MMM solution, but they were talking about MTA. And I was just thinking, and then after like maybe half hour, I asked, are you talking about MTA or MMM? I said, well, yeah, we call this MTA because, our management thought of it as MTA. So we kept the name, and in some way, well, we laughed at that point. But when you think about it, they were not that wrong, because for a client, they really, they don't think of it in engineering terms as some of us engineers do. They think of it as a business problem. They don't have an MTA or MMM problem. They have a business problem. And to them, whether this touch point is an offline touch point, which comes from TV, or is it an online touch point that comes from display, that's more or less the same thing, right? So they were thinking of it more holistically across all terms, so all channels. So the reason I'm saying this is that the definition has evolved. So initially it started with fractional attribution as a contrast to last touch, but I think in some cases it's evolved to become at least some advertisers think of it more broadly as more of a cross channel, which could even include, in a way, becoming some sort of an MMM solution. So where you want to pick that, I would probably anything that is addressable, if this is my definition, anything that is addressable, I will call it within the domain, or any channel that is addressable, I will call it within the domain of MTA, and probably other things in MMM. But again, that's just a definition, matter of definition.
MTA is personalization for MMMs, basically, is sort of
personalization, more granular, or some think of it as more granular MMM, which is not actually a very bad definition.
Right.
I mean, I would like that definition actually.
No, but I think your point here about not getting hung up on the semantics and focusing on really understanding at as fine-grained a level as is practical the relationship between investments you make and outcomes you get, and it just happens to be more sophisticated, more machine power to do it. So it's very helpful. One thing we like to do in these conversations is to tell stories, and so Would love to have you comment on some specific examples, no names needed, but that you had a chance to work on. Tell us a little bit about the specifics, what you were brought on to do, what worked, what was challenging, how you how you kind of got to a good solution. Just pick a couple of stories here that are sort of your most memorable ones.
Sure. I can think of retail, some retail applications. And the way I'm picking these examples is more talking about challenges, because that is probably more interesting to know what are the challenges and how you can overcome them. So one of the typical, and we also had the same thing with financial and banking. It's a problem across the board. When you have online and offline conversions, usually sometimes it's hard to tie. Obviously, there are solutions out there that tie offline and online, but they are not very credible. So usually the reason that we Visual IQ was brought on board to solve a MTA or MMM problem was to solve the marketing problem, right? We are spending all our money, a lot of money, on digital channels, on TV, on cross-channel. Now how can we understand that what worked? Like, for example, if I'm making $500 million a year and I'm spending like, I don't know, $50 million on advertising, how much of that 500 was generated by the 50 million? So that was the key question. But very quickly we would realize that this is not really this is a means to an end, but it's not an end in of itself. It's more about, okay, now I understand how these channels work. How can I invest in
what do I do
more effective channel, and how I dial back on the less effective channels, and how I can predict what happens in the future. And this was one of the things that always was an issue for us, that the predictive power of the models, right? Because the sales and conversions are not only obviously a function of marketing activities. They're, as a matter of fact, maybe at most 20-30% of this. A lot of that comes from other reasons or factors. And we are not there to build a holistic model across everything, how external factors are contributing to this. But a lot of the times, when the models are built for clients, they want to have kind of a broader understanding. But to get back to the MPA the question at hand, essentially the idea was to understand how basically the digital channels work, how the offline channels work, and how the interactions between them work. So that's really one of the reasons. And in terms of challenges, there are many challenges in MTA that I can go over this and how you can overcome that. One of them is again tying offline and online together. That's always obviously a big problem. Then one of the things that, especially when you're thinking about MTA and a multi-touch attribution solution, not all the touch points are on the same position along the conversion funnel. And for building a model that treats them the same is always a challenge. It's, first of all, it's not very correct, and also differentiating among them is not, it's not very practical. And so one of the key challenges that we had was understanding the role of each channel within the conversion funnel. And another thing is that actually becoming much more, in a way, demand that a lot of clients more and more have and continue to have now is incremental versus causal versus correlational model. So many clients want to understand the causal relation between marketing activities and conversions. A lot of these models that, in a way, many vendors offer, they are correlational. And that, when you build a model and when you come, to, in a way, act on the models, then you can very easily get into wrong answers, because it's, the same correlations may not be holding in the future. Right? Building the causality is very important and very difficult, and one of the challenges. And when we confronted those challenges in terms of the solutions that we offered, we always thought of this as, you need to take a step back and use MTA as a important piece of the puzzle, but not that as the whole piece.
Right.
You need to kind of have a broader perspective of things and understand the causal relationship. Maybe you can complement your MTA with an MMM solution, and then let them work together, and so you can make more of a holistic decisions based on your MMM. And when you get into more granular decision making, then you can leverage your MTA.
The example of that distinction that sort of got driven home for me a few years back was, this notion that search behavior and display behavior may be correlated, but search doesn't necessarily drive you to click on a display ad. Rather, exposure to display ad may drive you to actually do a search. And
Yeah.
and that's fundamentally, I think, the difference between sort of a correlation and a causal one in this case. One of the things that I think is I had the good fortune to work on with Visual IQ a few years back, actually. Actually, this is in a professional services context. In terms of the customer that we were jointly serving, was to try to reel folks in from the temptation to kind of throw all the data into the bucket together and sort of ask, and just let the machine tell you kind of what the right price for each channel was. I wonder just if there are particular stories that you have that sort of illustrate kind of the best way to kind of sequence or roadmap an MTA implementation.
Mm-hmm.
How much can you do at once, or is there an example of that stands out for you that is instructive?
Yeah, I think you definitely want to stage it out, and in terms of the data collect. First of all, I think the most effective MTA solution is one where you have your data house in order, your internal, essentially your first party data. I call it, when I say first party, I'm not only talking about traffic data, but much more broadly. I think
right. Your house file, for example, your CRM file.
Yeah, your CRM. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's things that ultimately, or hopefully, they end up in your CRM, so you can track them,
true.
Right, and understanding basically could be able to collect them. Obviously, you have to be collecting them. You have to be able to organize them and name them by the right attribute, and the taxonomy question, right? And another thing that you really want to do is connecting the data, right? And so break the data silos. I don't think before you go through this exercise, you will be able to implement anything successful, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the most successful applications are where the house is in order first, or the vendor helps in some cases that we help the client to put the house in order, right?
Yeah.
But that is really essential. And I think throwing everything in the mix is always very tempting. I talked about online and offline and the position of the stimulate, in a way, the touch points along the conversion funnel. That is also something that you want to be very, very careful about. For example, let's say it's a bank, and then you have a bunch of ads served. When you're in the ATM at the bank, let's say you want to you have some solution that can tie that to your other media that you have served, but do you really want to treat them on the same level? Obviously not, because the person who is at the bank is very different from someone who doesn't even probably know this bank has branches in their area, right? So they're very different, but customers are very much, or clients are very tempted into putting them all together, and we always had to be educating the client a lot in terms of do not do this, and make sure that take things at least gradually. If you want to add more down the funnel channels, let's do it later, right? So once you have a better grasp of what's happening top of the funnel. So I think these are the couple of things that I would definitely think that will be helpful in terms of implementing this. And also, I think that ultimately, going back to our question about causality and so forth, a lot of these MTA solutions, unless you're willing to run design experiments and do design of experiment and measure the incrementality, which again, you can have technical debate whether that actually captures the entire incrementality. That's another thing that, especially on smaller channels that they want to put, a lot of clients in our experience were very much tempted that, let's say, online video works very well, right? And they can see that in their attribution model. So, well, I want to put all my money on this. Well, maybe if you do that, you start getting into the point of diminishing return. Maybe you want to run some experiment and gradually dial it up, right?
Right.
And then running those things are also some, I think some challenges involved, obviously, because you have to incur extra costs of experimentation. Sure. But I think, going back to your point, I think that's extremely important that you don't just jump into solution because a model indicated a positive direction, because
Yeah.
as soon as you do, you may not get as much benefit as you were getting before.
Was there one thing I want to come back to here that I think is really important is you're saying basically to a certain degree you have to have your data house in order before you can really take advantage of MTA, and in particular you have to have your first party data in good shape. What litmus test would you apply to judge whether or not somebody was ready to do, say, a relatively straightforward kind of 2 or 3 channel cross optimization? Let's say, search, display, and email for retargeting, right? How would you judge? What are the things you would look for in a client's data situation to say, okay, we're ready to go?
Yeah, so it's a good good question, whether there is a formula for that. But I think the things I will be looking for is, I think understanding, one of the very first things I will be looking for, it doesn't matter if it is 2 channels or 3 channels or email or display, things I would be looking for is that, do you understand the purpose, why, typically you're running a bunch of campaigns. Do you know how these campaigns, or do you at least have some hypothesis that relates these campaigns to the outcome of interest? Do you know why you're even running them? You
Interesting
even characterize them.
Yeah.
And you even put a name on, yeah, I'm running this to get this, right? And interesting, you expect that it must be known, but in many cases it's not.
Oh, I agree. It's funny.
If it is done, it's more like what we call it, or used to call it, visual IQ tribal knowledge, right? So it is, if you, after, talking to 5 people, you may figure out, but it's not nowhere in the data that tells you that. So I think
that is a really interesting answer, because I thought you were going to go someplace that was much more technical to basically say, well, give us a data sample. If we see a lot of missing values or outliers or things like that, then we'll kind of know that things are messy. But you're actually getting at a point that I think is much more practical and fundamental that I really like, which is this notion of if folks can't answer a simple question like, hey, how did that campaign do?
Or why you ran
then
it, right?
they probably don't. It's sort of like where there's one mouse, there are many mice. There's that expression, right?
That's right.
And I think it's funny because I've had a very similar experience in the past. I actually way in the deep past, once asked a very senior executive that question, and the answer was, well, we were just too busy getting the campaign out the door to actually instrument it to measure it.
Yes.
That's what I was saying. Okay, well, that's actually a fairly that's interesting, not just at a technical level. That's a very philosophically interesting sort of answer, So anyway,
at least be able to tell what was the expectation of it, right? And
even more fundamental, like what you expect.
What was the expectation? Why you were running this, and also be able to characterize these, because that's really the characterization of those campaigns are the thing that ultimately helps the model to be better and smarter.
Right.
But what you said on the readiness is also absolutely right. But that comes more of a, after you start looking at the data, then you see, oh my goodness, I mean, this is in some cases it's really in good shape. Some clients are really good. And, in many cases, they start with a little bit of a not so good position, but, after 2 or 3 refreshes, they have everything. Right? And that is also extremely indicative of, how ready they are and how successful that exercise will be.
Yeah. Also, I think I want to come back to the point you made about testing, because obviously for us, testing is a very key piece of what we found is really helpful to clients, in particular as they try to look forward under rapidly changing conditions. But they tend to think of testing as sort of this thing you do off to the side, as opposed to sort of incorporating it into your data stream and actually having, look back windows that are sort of, not so deeply historical that they sort of drown out the impacts of the tests.
Mm-hmm.
Is there sort of a practical sort of balance that you've observed in terms of the mix of sources of, sort of historical data versus test data for making good judgments?
Yeah, I mean, one thing you can do first, I think you want to reserve mostly these tests for channels. We talked about bottom of the funnel, top of the funnel. Usually the ones that are bottom of the funnel get over attributed. Maybe you want to do the testing. If you want to prioritize that, which channels you want to test, you want to do it on maybe more of a bottom of the
Yeah.
funnel, because they, otherwise they can get all the credit.
Right.
But in terms of exactly how you can combine them, I think there are definitely, mathematically speaking, there is a way to do that. I mean, you can think of the test as some way, some creative of some kind, right? And then if whatever that creative gets attributed to, then you can take as a baseline and subtract from everything else. So if you don't want to do a separate exercise, if you want to blend everything into one holistic way of processing your data, this is one way to go.
Yeah.
Right. And calculate the baseline based on your experimental or PSAs or what have
Yeah.
you, and subtract. But there are methodologies, many different methodologies of doing this.
Yeah.
That's in and of itself science, right?
Right. That's part of part of the fun of this. Exactly. So let me shift gears. This has been obviously a crazy year. What do you observe about trying to do MTA under the conditions that we've experienced this year? What advice would you have for people who are trying to get something like that off the ground under these conditions? And feel free to say everything from hunker down to just put it on pause. I'm just curious where along that spectrum you might end up, or maybe there's a different axis.
So I think it's a fantastic question. I don't know if there's a right answer to a right answer that can be helpful for everyone. But I think there are several things you can always tell, especially when it comes to MTA. One of the problems with MTA or challenges with MTA is that if you think of it as more like digital attribution as opposed to broader MMM or granular MMM definition, then it usually misses all these external factors. One of the things that I personally like about granular MMM as opposed to standard MMM is that you can start including all these external factors in the model, right? So that's one of the things that MTA definitely has a challenge with respect to that, because now that we are in this area, in this period of time, things have changed. Some things might have temporarily been on hold, but some things might have permanently shifted. For example, consumer behavior, we can hypothesize that it has probably permanently shifted. If like a lot of things that were happening offline are going to be happening online. Even, the field that I'm now interested in, healthcare, telemedicine was really more like an experimental. Nobody took it seriously until 8 months ago. Now it's becoming mainstream. And I don't think this is going to go away after COVID is over. Many other things. So I think that understanding those consumer behavior shifts is going to be critical. I think MTA will have huge challenges trying to measure that, again, because it's narrow.
It's just very narrow and blinkered.
It's very narrow. A lot of things that I've seen that a lot of folks, many companies, they want to focus, and they think that the best way to get out of this is give like offer and promotions. But do you want to really do that, or do you want to how you can optimize that? I mean, is really offers and promotions the solution to slow the sales, or there are other ways that you can do this? Another big thing is how, if you're building models that or solutions that use data across a bigger period prior and post-COVID, and for example, for granular MMM, that's going to be very important, because usually you have to look at least 1 year, preferably 2 or 3 years of data. And then blending these periods are going to be extremely difficult, right? Because you have pre-COVID and have a post-COVID. Now, how you can smartly blend the data, I think that's one thing that many, I think, advertisers should be thinking about at this point. Now, I think if I want to, again, from what's the best thing to do at this point, I think understanding consumer behavior changes, shifts is extremely important. Maybe running some tests, small tests, whether that's offering offers and promotions or any other things that you want to test in the new market. I think that's the way to go. Start small and experiment and collect some data. And then also how smartly you can blend your data prior and after this COVID broke out or the pandemic. It is going to be, I think, is very important.
That's very helpful. A popular, I mean, to put a buzzword on it, popular question right now from clients is like, how do I do personalization 2.0, whatever that means, whatever 1.0 was. And a lot of people are tempted in trying to, when they go to that level of grain of action, to go to a super deep level of grain of analysis and repricing of the channels. And I think what I'm taking from this conversation, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but it's distilling it for myself here, that it's really, really powerful, is this notion of trust but verify.
Yeah.
When you're using MTA, be sure that the data is good in the place that you're applying it. Start by applying it narrowly, but don't make sure that you do not lose sight of the bigger picture of the other factors outside of whether or not testing should be in the mix to sort of supplement this. Very much of a human in the loop kind of a philosophy to what you're doing, as opposed to thinking of it as this thing that is just basically a black box implementation, and then you sort of run with it. That's actually really valuable. So let me. I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask a little bit about your latest venture. You're up to some really cool stuff now. Before we go, I wanted to hear a little bit about that, how you navigated to that idea, and how it extends what you've been doing in the past.
Absolutely. But I'm focusing now, my company Change Squared, we are focusing on healthcare at this point. And one of the things that how I was drawn to this area, I identified a lack of consumer focus in healthcare in general. And we can think of all different reasons that might be the case, whether it's because our healthcare system is based on sickness model as opposed to wellness model, and why that is. We can always find reasons that why that is the situation. But if you think about it, more and more the consumer focus needs to be brought back into healthcare to make it more, even to help with the costs of delivering the care. And when we are thinking about also healthcare, I mean, we always think of it as we don't go to doctor because you have to, not because you want to. You buy an iPhone because you want to. So there is a difference. So someone may argue, well, healthcare is not the same as, let's say, consumer, products and so forth. To some extent, it's true. But if you look at the broader healthcare landscape, from medical, dental practices to, other, businesses, organizations that they have, more of consumer focus, like, dental implants, or you might have cosmetic surgery and things like that. They're expensive. The decision time to make a decision whether you want to go ahead with this procedure or not is long, is expensive. So one of the things we're focusing around, we find an opportunity is, how you can best acquire customers. Patient acquisition is, I think, extremely important. In operations is extremely important, how effectively you can service the patients and customers. Payments and the reimbursements is extremely important. And these are areas of someone with my background in AI and machine learning, it can be very instrumental to all these elements. And you asked about how this tie back to what I've been doing, especially we are focusing now on customer or patient acquisition and the operational aspects of it, which is very much in line with understanding how different touch points drive. Now, think of, again, making a decision about cosmetic surgery or about, some, dental implants or what have you. Then these are, expensive decisions, and there are a lot of multiple touch points involved in how you can run analytics and advanced analytics and so forth and so on. So the way we are now focusing on, we are, building a provider facing analytics and AI solutions like dashboards or prescriptive analytics, what should be your right patient mix and so forth, right? And another group of products and services that we're thinking about is what I call virtual concierge, is, patient facing or customer facing, and, answering a lot of repetitive questions or scheduling. That's a key thing that we're working on. That because that's, putting the patient in the right spot is not always easy. There is a little bit of a science involved in doing that. And this is an area where we think that, technologies such as AI, advanced analytics, learning can be very instrumental. So that's what we are building, and very excited for that. Actually, we are, getting some good conversations, in this area. And we'll see how it works.
I'm always fascinated to hear about how people like you who have the background that you do, the engineering and in this case the entrepreneurial background as well, sort of are inspired by patterns they see in one domain and are able to apply those patterns in another. And I think this is certainly one of the more interesting, translations, I think, of that. When you said patient mix, my mind immediately ran to media mix. And I guess at
Exactly.
some
Right?
level, it's really disturbing to think about,
Yeah.
a patient mix model and a media mix model
Yeah.
sort of being at some level, having some common DNA. But there you go. So.
Yeah.
Well, Payman, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation, and really grateful to have your insights and perspectives on this topic, because I know that it's top of mind for a lot of executives who are trying to make big decisions about how to take their whole organizations forward. And there's a lot of wisdom in what you've shared with us. So I really
Thank
appreciate
you
it.
so much. It was really a pleasure to speak with you. And yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Terrific. Well, I'll look forward again to the next chat soon.